Great. So now that we're all set, I'm so happy to introduce our guest presenter today, Jodie McDonald. So Jodie is a registered social worker, psychotherapist, and past executive director for the Cowichan Family Caregiver Support Society. Jodie has over 20 years of experience working in crisis intervention, family support, mental health, and community development, and she currently owns the private practice Living and Breathing, which you can find in the list of helpful resources posted in the chat box. And we'll post that again shortly for you as well. Great, so Jodie, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and pass it over to you.
So my name is Jodie. I'm really happy that you're choosing to spend an hour with me today, and I hope it will be helpful for you in the work that you're doing. To start off, I want to say um, how much I respect and value that I have for the work of caregiving. And I know that for those of us who are caregivers or who are in the role of caregiver or supporting a caregiver, we don't always have that work recognized as much as it needs to be, maybe from our larger community or even sometimes the healthcare systems that we work in. So I just want to frame everything that I'm talking about in a huge hug of respect and love for the work of caregiving. Um, I'm going to start talking about an idea that I have experience with that I see um, being very helpful to caregivers. And this idea is really about boundary practice. So I know that the workshop or the presentation is titled Family Dynamics in Dementia Caregiving. We're going to absolutely get to that, but the first idea that I want to talk about is actually about boundary practice. But just trust me, I'm gonna rein it all in together. Um, so in just a moment, I'm going to share my screen and we'll start talking about boundary practice. Okay, so let's see here. Here we go. One there, and now I just have to make that, sorry, just bear with me for 1 second. There we go. Okay. So I want to talk about this idea of boundaries, and you'll see why in a moment. But the way that I like to talk about boundaries, you heard me say the word boundary practice, and so it's maybe a little different. It's about the way that we relate to other people. So, if you were to Google the word boundaries, or if you've heard the word boundaries talked about, we usually, when we're saying that word, we mean saying no. It's often a shorthand for saying no. And we mean that almost like as a communication skill. So the ability to say no. And I want to suggest that, from how I think about boundaries, it's much more than about saying no. A lot of us, if you relate to the idea of sometimes having trouble saying no or setting limits, that's actually not a communication skill problem. Most of us have the ability to find the words that we need to say the things that we need to say. So I like to reframe this idea of saying no or setting limits, setting boundaries, as actually being, if it's challenging for us, it's because it's the way that we relate to other people and the role that we take in relationships. So the boundaries that I'm going to talk about today are not really about saying no. They're about saying no and saying yes to others and to ourselves. And so sometimes we also use the word boundary to talk about physical space or ethical practice, but those are not the things that I want to talk about. The way that I'm using this word boundary is is the idea of the ways that we relate to other people, to others and to ourselves. And the way that this relates to caregiving, as we're going to see, is actually because um, the sometimes we have patterns of relating from before we started our role as caregivers that can make caregiving more challenging for us. So that's what we're going to look at today. Boundaries really is about an inner sense of self. How do we know what is me and what is someone else? So those sensations or feelings or perceptions that come from the inside, from your inner experience. And for most of us, especially in a caring role, what happens when we get with someone whose needs are greater than ours is a lot of the time we lose that sense of connection to our inner self. So I like to do this with my hands. It's like, so it's kind of a visual thing, but it's like, so I can be focused and attuned on someone else. So, it's like you imagine having mirrors or sensors on your hands. And so, okay, I'm attuning into you and I'm seeing what you need. And then I'm going to send my energy out to give you what you need. And what I'm talking about in boundary practice is also about being able to tune into myself, to ourselves, to be able to notice what I need. So, in that sense, a healthy boundaries would look like I can see you and I can see me. I can hear what you need and I can hear what I need. And it's going back and forth between those two things. It's feeling that sense of connection to another person while feeling connected with ourselves. And I think what happens a lot in in human service or caregiving or times when our job is to care for other people is we just do a lot of this and we forget about this part, right? It's kind of all this all the time. And that makes it really hard for us to take good care of ourselves. So we're going to look at this a little more closely. And honestly, if you have questions for me, please just put them in the chat. I'll see them. So in what I'm talking about boundary practice, and I know I'm going a little fast, but I want to get to the part where this is, I want to make sure we have time to talk about all the things I want to talk about in this hour. To set boundaries, we need to be able to identify our own experience and differentiate it from another person's experience. So that means, if someone else is frustrated or someone else is sad, and we feel something in relation to that, to what they're feeling, empathy would mean that, we feel with another person. That's actually what empathy means. We're feeling along with them. But in a boundary practice, it means that we're able to see that what we're feeling is actually our own feeling, right? We're not feeling the other person's feeling. We're feeling our own feeling about their feeling, right? So when someone else is sad, we might feel sad, but we're really just recalling our own experiences of sadness. In boundary practice, it's really important to be able to differentiate what is someone else's and what is ours. Boundaries are essentially, you can almost imagine, and in my practice, I do this with yarn. I have a basket of yarn and I get people to take a ball of yarn and you know, you can put the yarn around you and have the idea of a boundary, a visible sense of a container for your sense of self. So that's how I'm talking about boundaries. Boundaries are a container we create for our own energy, our own essence, our selfhood. And you can think about it like this, like what happens to your sense of yourself if it has no container? If we have no ability to tune into ourselves and notice what we're feeling, especially when we might be overwhelmed, and especially when the things that we're dealing with on a daily basis are very challenging and sometimes feel too hard for us. Right? So what I'm talking about in terms of this ability not only to do this, but also to do this, to tune into ourselves, is actually about noticing and naming how we feel and not just, it's the opposite of that philosophy of pushing through. Um, here's some of the reasons why boundary practice is important. So when we care for others without boundaries, we experience more resentment and frustration and fatigue and burnout because there's no separation, there's no buffer between how the other person feels and how we feel. Without boundaries, we're more vulnerable to compassion fatigue. So, compassion fatigue, if you think about what those words mean, it literally means tired of caring. And I think any of us who have been caregivers come to a place on any given day or week or month where we experience the feeling of being tired of caring, which is actually very hard for us to experience. And I think sometimes we feel guilty about that. Boundary practice helps us to notice before long. Okay, I'm just going to check the chat, sorry. before too long, to be able to notice a little a little sooner when we're starting to notice that we're getting tired of caring. And to also, this boundary that I'm talking about, which is like that container for your sense of self, that's a very self-compassionate and kind place where there's no judgment. Yeah, okay. Um, Without boundaries, I'm also mentioning the word vicarious traumatization. That's a very big word that comes from, sort of social work and other helping professions, but essentially it means when we're caring for someone who's going through something very difficult, who's having very difficult times, and we're a witness to what they're experiencing. It's not happening to us, but it has an effect on us to see another person suffering or to see another person in difficulty. And again, these are the kinds of stressors that caregiving brings. They're not something that is our fault, or they're not a sign that we're caregiving wrong. These are, the organic hazards of caregiving that are part of almost everyone's experience. When we care without boundaries, we actually have less energy for our own lives, our own goals, and our own interests because there's not enough of ourselves in our own life. And I really hear this a lot from caregivers about how when you're a caregiver, especially in dementia care, where it's very hard to take time for oneself. It's very hard to feel like, in the face of what the person we're caring for is dealing with and all the things that come with that, that our own interests or our own needs are important at all. But as we're going to see, it's again, it's kind of what I'm saying. It's like that's the example of when we are all about the other person and we kind of don't um, don't remember to put our own energy or our own sense of self on the map. And we're going to see in a moment why that's somewhat challenging and makes our caregiving harder. So I'm suggesting that that awareness of our inside experience can help us to take better care of ourselves and stay in balance so that boundaries actually make our caregiving sustainable. I'm not suggesting that we take our focus away from the other person because I know that that's essentially what caregiving is, right? It's to use our intelligence, our empathy, our relationship to know what the other person needs and how to care for them. What I'm suggesting is it's important to remember to sometimes also check in with ourselves and see how we're doing. Right? Take a breath into our bodies and say to ourselves, just notice how we're experiencing that moment, that day, right? To name it for ourselves. This is very hard, right? And then to come back into our caregiving role. Boundaries are especially important in family caregiving because as a caregivers, we're deliberately placing ourselves in a position of service. And that means our goal is to give to another person, to identify their needs and to help them. So that's really what the role is. And when the needs of the other person that we're caring for consistently exceed our own needs, it makes it seem very logical to deny our own needs. So sometimes I do this like this, it's like if you think about any given day in your caregiving role, and the needs of the person you're caring for might be this high. And relative to that, your needs might feel like they're about this high, you know? Relative to what they need, your needs are not so big. And so those are the conditions that lead us to like, oh, well, I don't need to go for that walk, or I don't need to go to the bathroom if I need to go. I don't need to eat my lunch. Like, we put our own needs off. But the problem with this is you can be a wonderful, excellent caregiver and do everything right. You can have a day where you don't get frustrated, where things, you get a lot done, you're productive, and you feel like you've had your best day of caregiving. You've knocked it out of the park, and you will wake up the next morning, and the needs of the other person will still be this high. That's actually the conditions of the role, right? So do you see how if that's true, if even your best offering doesn't actually change this very much, that it's not sustainable to not meet our own needs at least some of the time, even if our needs seem not as great as the person that we're caring for. Does that make sense? And so this is what I mean when I say, it feels very logical to be focused on the other person. But if we're not adding in this sometimes caring and connecting to ourselves, to see ourselves in what we're doing. Um, okay, yes, we're going to talk about the feeling of guilt. That is a big part of what we're talking about here. Because guilt is is really okay, I'm just going to read Lori's question. Yes. So we're absolutely going to talk about this idea of what happens when we feel like we're bad and we've done something wrong. That's essentially the feeling of guilt. Guilt is a very poor motivator. And the reason for that, as we'll get into in a moment, is that, whenever we do something out of guilt to avoid the feeling that I'm bad and I've done something wrong, avoid the feeling that I'm a bad person, and we'll do something as with guilt as a motivator. We're actually creating, I think about it like, we're taking a shovel full of resentment and we're putting it on the pile for the future. And eventually this pile of resentment is going to get so big that it falls on top of us, right? And so that those feelings that we often get in caregiving, especially when we're allowing our guilt to motivate us, are actually creating a future situation of resentment where we're going to get angry and feel very frustrated. And so sometimes I talk about how guilt and resentment are actually the rock and the hard place of caregiving, right? Because sometimes if we're acting from a place of guilt, we're going to lead ourselves to resentment. When we get resentful and we might get angry, we might act out, and we don't always have those feelings towards the person we're caring for. Sometimes we have those feelings towards other family members or towards the healthcare system, but we get that kind of peak of resentment and then we usually go back over to a sense of guilt. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to offset that through this practice of boundary. We know that while giving feels good, I mean, most of us, are consenting to being caregivers. We wish to care for the person that we're caring for, but giving more than we're able to or we wish to on any given day and day in and day out, it feels stressful and it creates resentment and guilt and it makes it really hard to keep giving. It's the place where we start to feel like the role of caregiving is actually eroding our sense of self and our sense of well-being, which is another theme that I hear a lot. Caregivers, obviously, we don't always feel like we have permission to say no or set limits. And that's exactly like the question that just came was about what happens when you might have respite available to you, but you feel very guilty um, about having the person you're caring for go into respite so that you can get a break, especially if it feels like they are not consenting to go. Right. So, of course, as caregivers, again, I think it's about this, right? If the other person in their state, their needs seem greater than ours. And that's the logic that makes us feel like our needs don't matter. Except the thing that caregiving is based on is our ability to continue to meet another person's needs over time, even when those needs are demanding and exceeding sometimes our capacity. So again, something like respite is about sustainability of caregiving. And I think guilt is easier to deal with when you have a framework for your sense of self, right? And again, I'm going to talk a little bit about how self-compassion is a really lovely companion practice to boundary work. It's truly, I say this sometimes, it's an essential skill of being in service to others to learn how to be a good steward of your own energy. Caregiving is one of the roles that we may have in life where it's especially challenging to be what I call a good steward of your own energy, because your energy, your sense of yourself is challenged by the role of caregiving. But we can always learn. We can learn a little better to be a little bit better of a steward of our own energy. And one of the ways that that happens is because sometimes what's making our caregiving role more difficult are actually some of the patterns of relating that we had even before we were a caregiver, right? And this is true especially in family caregiving when, the person we're caring for is our spouse, if the person we're caring for is our parent. There are long established pre-existing roles or patterns of relating that may make the way that we care more difficult. So we're going to take a look at that. We're going to take a look at that in more detail right now. So I'm going to describe to you 3 patterns of relating, 3 ways of doing boundary. We're going to talk about vague boundaries, rigid boundaries, and healthy, flexible boundaries. Really, we're going to focus most of our energy on patterns of vague boundaries. And the reason for that is, as I've said, this is the one that I think a lot of caregivers struggle with. It's the thing that makes us much more prone to giving all of our energy away and not keeping any energy for ourselves. And it makes us feel like even that idea of separating our feelings from someone else or taking some space for ourselves makes us feel guilty, makes us feel selfish, right? And so in a pattern of vague boundaries, I want to suggest we have very little, accuracy for seeing what is actually selfish. We are not usually very selfish at all. In fact, we're very selfless. We're very selfless, but it makes it very hard to take space or time for ourselves without that feeling of guilt. And so I just want to explain a little bit why that is. These patterns of relating, like honestly, most of the structure of this we learned very early in our lives, like usually in our first families, and we all have sort of a dominant pattern of relating. Those of us who identify with having a lot of empathy or being kind of a caregiver for most of our lives, even before we were an official caregiver with a capital C, we might notice that we have a pattern of vague boundaries. And in this pattern, it just means that our sense of connection to other people is so important to us. It's such an important place of emotional safety for us that we can forego our connection to ourselves. So it's that idea, right? That we're so focused. My connection with you is so important to me that, oh, I don't need a connect. That's fine. Where would you like to go for dinner? Oh, no, it doesn't matter. I'll go wherever you want to go. Do you see what I mean? It's that idea of we're really focused in this direction. So we put other people's needs and desires first, which is a good way to be. Except in this pattern, we do that even when it actually harms us to do so. And we don't notice the harm that is happening to us. We don't know ourselves in this style of relating. We don't know ourselves that well, our preferences, our needs, and our feelings, because we tend to be really focused on the connection we can make with other people by connecting to what they need. So again, it's that idea of sometimes maybe we do get a day to ourselves or some time off, and we get the opportunity to tune into ourselves. And sometimes we don't even know what we would want to do with that day. We don't even know what would be restorative to us, right? And again, I use sometimes that example of like, where do you want to go for dinner? And it's like, oh no, it doesn't matter. And it's like, how do we not know where we want to go for dinner? Like, of course, there's always a preference. But really, in this style of relating, where we want to go for dinner is so much less important than the connection that we have with the other person, right? So we're not going to jeopardize that. In this style of relating, we have trouble saying no and setting limits. We act on behalf of others and not on our own behalf. We act as though the needs of others are more important than our own needs, and that actually makes us less aware of our needs over time. So I think about this like a volume knob, like the volume knob on our inner voice, the thing that tells you, I'd rather do this instead of that. That's really turned down and sometimes quite muted, so that if we do get a time to tune into ourselves, we don't even see the value of that. And in this pattern of relating, we often have trouble seeing or respecting other people's boundaries, but in a nice way, in a caregiving way, in a kind way, right? So we can be somewhat unboundaried in our care for other people because our priority is on connection. We're also afraid of losing connection to others or disappointing them if we tell the truth about our feelings or take space to meet our own needs. And in caregiving, we can see this a lot of the time, where if we have this pattern of relating where we are the person who who tunes into others and gives them what they need, just generally in our family, when the needs of the person that we're caring for uh, necessitate that we become a primary caregiver to someone, that often means that we can't do this as much as we did before to other people. Do you see? We can't provide or be as connected to other people. And it's really hard for us to tell the truth about our feelings, and take the space to meet our own needs. When we notice in this pattern of relating someone else's need, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to not try to meet that need. And we feel very anxious if we're aware of what someone else needs and we're not able to take steps to meet that. So again, in this style of relating, it's all about connecting with other people. But again, as I mentioned before, this style of boundary practice also inevitably produces feelings of anger or even rage. And again, this is hard for us to picture this, right? But if you have ever found yourself saying to anyone, I've done this and this and this and this for you, and you can't even do this for me, that is what I mean by this, right? It's when we've been so other focused and not tuning into ourselves, not taking care of ourselves, but we kind of expect that it's going to come back around and someone's going to take care of us. But they don't. So then all of a sudden we are noticing all the ways that we've been taking care, and we feel quite angry and justified in that anger. And those feelings are really important. They're an authentic response to a pattern, which is essentially self-abandonment, right? We take that anger out on other people, but really it's ourselves who hasn't been looking after ourselves. And so it's that idea that I think this is quite hard for us when we are all about connection to someone else, but we hit the limit of how much we can abandon ourselves. We hit the limit of that, which is actually a good thing, but then we might get angry, we might lash out at someone who's not even in that dynamic, and then we feel guilty again. And we usually come right back out with that desire to connect with other people. So it's not actually others who have failed to meet our needs. Most of the time, it's again, it's that mute button, or the fact that we haven't really been attuning to ourselves or creating enough space for ourselves in our own life. So that's a picture of vague boundaries. I know I'm going a little quickly. And I want to talk about rigid boundaries. And really, many people have this pattern of rigid boundaries. But sometimes those of us who have more of a vague boundary style, we swing over to rigid boundaries when we get to that place of anger or frustration or rage, right? That place of resentment. And so this might be a place that we come to temporarily, but sometimes we don't last too long here. So in a pattern of rigid boundaries, we feel a strong need to protect ourselves, and we can be defensive from this place. We feel separate from others, and that feels safer to us to feel separate. The idea in this pattern of relating is that emotional safety comes from space. So what I said before with vague boundaries, my connection with you is so important to me. Oh, I don't need a connection to myself. I'm willing to forego my connection to myself. But in rigid boundaries, it's the idea that like, okay, I'm connected to myself. I can hear my inner voice. I can, the volume's turned up in it, but if I connect with you, I'm going to lose this sense of myself, right? So this kind of boundary is actually more like a wall. It feels like I can maintain this sense of connection to myself if I keep other people at a distance. And again, sometimes when we've been all in our vague boundary pattern and giving all of our energy away, it feels like a relief to come into this state of a rigid boundary. We fear in this state that we're going to lose our sense of connection to ourselves if we connect with someone else, right? This is the state from which we don't want to talk about it. We don't want anybody to help us. We kind of just want people to leave us alone. We say no frequently. We're sometimes grumpy about saying no, and we often say no more forcefully than we mean to. Okay. And we often choose rigid boundaries after having vague boundaries and getting hurt or exhausted. And then the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. So do you see how these two states are connected? Like a lot of the time, if we're giving too much in our connection to other people, then this is where we have to take our energy back. So sometimes I do this with my hands, so you'll have to bear with me here. This is kind of like, demonstrates a healthy boundary. Like each person comes about halfway, 50%. But in caregiving, we know that the person we're caring for cannot be fully present for us or be in this kind of, pattern of relating. So sometimes they may be at over here at 20%, you know? And in order to connect to them and to provide for them, we will go to 80 in order to make sure that we can be connected. But the problem with this is that if we continually go to 80 in this way, it also means that at some point we're going to have to go back to 20 just for self-preservation. And this is really tough for us because we're either giving all of our care and all of our energy away, or we're here and we can sometimes feel grumpy and frustrated and resentful and churlish, and we don't want any kind of connection. And so I'm suggesting that a healthy boundary pattern means that we can stay here. We can stay at 50, a lot more. Yes, we have to meet the person where they are. We go when we need to, and then we come back to 50, right? We might go, we use our discernment and our kind of, we understand our consciousness. We know that, okay, I'm going to have to do more than I want to right now, but when I can, I'm going to come back to this place of not overgiving. And this allows us to stay here and not leave. It allows us to be more present because I know that it's actually very difficult for us and somewhat exhausting to be going back and forth in such a wide range. I'm hoping this is making sense and landing for some of you at least. I'm going to talk about a little bit more how this actually works with caregiving. But first, this slide is really, this slide is actually about kind of a basic theory of attachment, but I think that it's often quite helpful. So if you think about this, just ignore the words at the bottom for a moment. And if you think about this continuum, this line, that really says that everybody needs bond and everybody needs breathing room, right? These are basic human needs. Everyone has the need for bond and everyone has the need for breathing room. When we don't get enough bond, whether as a pattern in our lives, we don't feel enough connection or just on any given day or conversation, it gives rise to feelings of abandonment. And those feelings are kind of anxious. They're like, we feel like the safety would be reestablished through more connection, right? So we have that feeling of longing or wanting to be in connection with others. But we focus a lot on bond, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but we also need breathing room as a fundamental need. And when we don't get enough breathing room, it gives rise to feelings of inundation. Inundation is such a great word. It means flooding, right? It means flooded. It means overwhelmed. In a state of inundation, we fear losing our sense of self or being consumed or overwhelmed. And in this state, this is safety would be space, right? The feeling of flooding and it's too much. And I believe that certain things that we do in life, caregiving, um, and other times, like maybe being a parent of young children or certain jobs that we do, are inherently inundating. They're inherently overwhelming. And they also are because our role as a caregiver is essentially to provide bond, right? That we don't get enough breathing room in these roles. It's really hard to get breathing room. So again, let's talk about guilt again, right? A lot of us, this is essentially what I'm trying to suggest to you, is that a lot of us came into the role of caregiving already with a pattern of vague boundaries where it's our our role or our comfort to be making connections through connecting to other people. And when it becomes our main role to care for another person whose needs are going to exceed our own, it's very, very difficult to be the person whose role it is to provide bond. Because especially in dementia caregiving, the way that I'm describing boundary practices, it's actually relational, right? It's about us and another person. Healthy boundaries is sort of like I'm fully present and you're fully present. But we know in dementia caregiving that that's not always the case. So we might be providing bond, but it doesn't mean that we receive bond from the person that we're caring for. This is another reason why it's so important to have that self-attunement and to see and hear ourselves in what we're doing. I see and believe that this idea of breathing room, and I mean, I'm not talking about hours and hours. I mean, that would be nice. Breathing room is also something that we can provide for ourselves by just noticing how inundated we are, by taking a breath, by naming the ways that we feel and telling ourselves the truth about how we feel and offering ourselves some self-compassion. So I've put some resources for self-compassion in the list of resources, and I believe that self-compassion practice is particularly good for caregivers and helpful for caregivers. And I'll just give you a quick synopsis of what it means. It's three things, three steps. So self-compassion practice means first to notice that you're suffering. And that first one is tough for a lot of us, right? Especially those of us who just put on our armor and push through things because we know they're too hard. But noticing that you're suffering can be as simple as saying, ow, or like, this is hard, right? It's just noticing that something is hard for you. And so that's the first step. The second step is to meet your suffering with kindness. Right? So I kind of I simplify this by saying the first one is ow, the second one is aw. It's to meet your suffering with, instead of saying, come on, get it together, just get back in there, is to say, to yourself, oh, this is hard. You know, to be kind to yourself in the face of your suffering. And the third thing that is so important, especially in caregiving, is this idea of locating your experience, your moment of suffering in common humanity. And that means anybody who's in a family role, um, caregiving for someone, is going to feel overwhelmed sometimes, is going to feel like running away, is going to feel incredibly inundated, is going to feel angry, is going to feel frustrated. Anybody is going to feel that way sometimes, right? And so I think that this practice is really helpful to offset a lot of the guilt that we feel, right? Because there's no way to do this kind of work without sometimes feeling guilty. It's just part of it. So it's about meeting yourself in those feelings of guilt. So in healthy, flexible boundaries, we can connect to someone else and stay connected to ourselves at the same time. That's the difference, right? I can be connected to you and I can also be connected to myself. We can see and hear ourselves so we know what we need, want, and feel most of the time, which I'm calling self-attunement. And we can separate our feelings from other people's feelings while still feeling empathy. And this helps us when the person that we're caring for or other people are not particularly happy with us, or they're not um, receiving the care in the way that we're offering it. So again, that's the idea that something is happening outside of our boundary that causes some feelings inside our boundary, but those two things are actually separate. So now I'm going to shift and just speak about some themes in caregiving families and how these themes, which are very common and very complicated and difficult sometimes, can be met a little bit more with boundary practice. So I've already mentioned the first one, which is that sometimes you can be aware that the primary caregiver, the person, if you're a caregiver, um, has a pattern of vague boundaries with the care receiver from before the caregiving began. And honestly, I'm just going to be very frank with you. If you recognize yourself in a pattern of vague boundaries, just kind of like as the pattern that you came in with, you're going to get creamed as a caregiver because there's no limit. There's no limit to your sense of energy and your sense of what you need to give to the other person. And again, I'm not suggesting in any way that you have to stop doing this part. It's about just adding a bit more of this. That's really what it is. It's a simple, subtle inner shift, but it brings you into your own life more so that you can take better care of yourself. So this is one of the themes that I see a lot is that when as caregivers, we were already having big boundaries and then we get into a caregiving role where all of a sudden the needs are this high every day. And this vague boundary pattern is going to be very hard for us to maintain. The second theme that I think is quite important and that I see a lot is that the care receiver, the person that you're caring for, may have more rigid boundaries or experience higher inundation. And so again, that feeling of, you know, a feeling overwhelmed or flooded, and we can feel that inundation feeling sometimes even in response to someone else's good intentions, someone else's care. So when our care receiver has more of a pattern of rigid boundaries, like, that they don't want to connect, that they would rather connect with themselves, and they can be grumpy and a little rigid around that, this makes the experience of being cared for more difficult and makes the experience of the caregiver more difficult. Do you see? And this is a very common pattern even in relationships where someone who needs more breathing room is in a relationship with someone who needs more bond. And then it just kind of goes back and forth. Caregiving, by definition, is a little inundating for the person being cared for. So sometimes the person being cared for has a high need for bond, and that feels quite inundating for the caregiver. But the reverse can also be true, that the caregiver can be very comfortable giving lots of bond, but the care receiver feels inundated by that. And that's a very challenging dynamic because it also it makes it hard for the caregiver to feel like what they're doing is valuable and welcome. Another theme, that I've seen a lot is when an adult sibling or an adult child is the caregiver for a parent. And this can be true even if there is a spouse caregiver, but there might be, often this dynamic takes place when maybe geographically one of the adult children lives closer, to their parents than the other siblings. And it's so common for conflict to arise within the siblings. And I want to suggest this is not actually because of the caregiving itself, but due to the underlying patterns. Yeah, thanks, Lori, of relating. So this means that, I'm just going to quickly summarize this theme, which is that, you know, we we connect with other people by providing bond. When we perceive that our sibling is providing bond for our parent more than we can feel quite outside of that. And one theme that I see in this dynamic is that a lot of the time the other siblings can be quite critical of the caregiving sibling or the sibling who's closer to the family dynamic. And it feels a bit like they're nitpicking. But what's happening there is actually that they feel quite insecure being outside of the bond. I hope that makes sense. So this is a way, again, to notice this through patterns of relating. And a lot of the time, the sibling caregiver can feel very criticized or picked on or even inundated by their other sibling. But it's because, there's a perception that they're actually more in a bonded relationship when we know that being a caregiver is challenging even when that is the case. Another theme is when the caregiver is a spouse, that adult children may not clearly see the relationship dynamics in their parents' marriage. Um, and this is partially because their own relationship with their parents, the bond and the breathing room that they provide for their parents, kind of dominates their experience. But the other theme is that everyone in a family has their own narrative. And what I've seen a lot of the time is there are dynamics in the marriage that the adult children don't know about. So not everyone is telling the same story about that, and it can make things much more challenging. Another theme is that if the primary caregiver is a spouse, they may have less bond to offer their adult children or other family or close friends because that's what they're offering so much every day to the caregiver. And that can also cause conflicts and shake things up in the family. Because, if our role has been to provide bond and then we're no longer able to do that role. So now, because this has gone by so fast and we just have a few minutes left. Um, yes, I know it's going by very fast, and absolutely, I will happily give the PowerPoint to Lori and to Sarah to share if they like. Um, Tips and strategies. So these are just 5 general ideas that may be helpful to you in your caregiving. The first one is a simple check your boundary. Have a sense of your boundary. Practice that, what I'm calling self-attunement throughout the day. This doesn't actually mean withdrawing your attention from others, but adding the idea of paying attention to yourself. So it's as easy as a little check-in. How am I doing? Take a deep breath and maybe picture having a boundary around yourself and remind yourself that it's okay to have a boundary. It's okay to have separate feelings than the person that you're caring for. It's very hard to meet your own needs when you don't know what they are. So even though we know that we cannot get our needs met most of the time when we're caregiving, it's really important to know what they are for those times when we can meet our needs. The second one is to offer yourself breathing room. Again, breathing room is the element, and I want to say, in that graphic of bond and breathing room is the one that we don't get much of in caregiving. Sometimes we're not getting enough bond either, but a lot of the time it's this dynamic where if caregiving is very inundating for us, it's actually breathing room that we need. So with self-compassion, to notice our need for breathing room as well as bond. And that might look like silence or something that doesn't actually help anybody else and is not interesting to anybody else. Notice what the thoughts or feelings arise for you when you feel the need for space. And again, I'm going to suggest a lot of the time that's where our guilt lies, is that we need space. And I want to normalize so much that breathing room is fundamental. It's as fundamental as bond. We need breathing room as much as we need bond. In fact, sometimes when our bond need is met, that's when the need for breathing room arises. So, you can gently coach yourself into normalizing the need for breathing room as well as bond. And then begin to connect times of irritation and anger, frustration, or despair to the absence of breathing room. You can look back and think, oh, I haven't had any space, and that's why I'm feeling, that's why I'm now in a pattern of rigid boundaries and just trying to carve out any time by sometimes being grumpy and irritable with other people. It's because I haven't had any breathing room at all. And you can meet yourself in the feelings of irritation and anger and frustration of guilt through more self compassion. Nobody can do caregiving without some guilt and resentment. I think the idea is not to avoid guilt and resentment, it's the ability to name what they are and have a way to respond to them. Oh, yes, I see you, guilt. There you are again. Right? Because it's the invitations to feel guilty and invitations to feel resentful will always come. And that is not a sign that you're doing caregiving wrong. That's just what caregiving is. It's very inundated and complicated relationally. So the third thing is to notice and name inundation. Notice when you feel inundated by the needs of others. And by inundated, again, I mean flooded, overwhelmed. It's too much. That feeling of like urgently needing space, because it cannot be anyone's job to provide bond for everyone at all times. We really must understand that that state of inundation is trying to tell us something about the imbalance in our lives. So notice when it's our role in relationship to be the provider of bond, and then practice bringing our energy or presence again back to halfway. And so by this, again, I mean when we're going all the time far over our boundary and going over to 80, this means that we're going to have to shift back and go to 20. And that's that state of inundation or rigid boundaries. If we practice, instead of going here all the time as our default move, we just try to stay here, in this neutral space, a boundaried space. And that will help us to offset being so overgiving and also being so inundated. The fourth thing is, which is sometimes very helpful, is to make your boundary visible, and by this I mean, practice just imagining yourself in a boundary or also seeing other people in their boundaries. That is such a relief to remember that other people also have boundaries and you don't always have to be in there either. You know, and what helps you to do is to draw a circle on a piece of paper and literally inside the circle, write what you're responsible for. What is in your boundary, right? How I feel, whether I get enough sleep, what my reaction to the things that happen, um, my sense of life satisfaction, my feelings of doing a good job. Those are the things that are inside your boundary, and they might be quite different for you. And then outside the circle, and this is why it helps so much to have a visual of this, outside the circle, write what you're not responsible for. What my daughter thinks about me, what my spouse's level of life satisfaction. Like there are things that are truly not our responsibility that we're engaging with and we're going to be invited to be responsible for, but actually those things are outside the circle. And you can slowly begin to notice that when you're working really hard to change what's happening outside your boundary, we're actually working too hard, right? So I'm so running out of time, but I just want to quickly say, so if you picture having a circle around you, and someone outside your boundary is angry, like out there, somebody's angry and they're upset. So, and you can't see my hand, so they're outside your boundary, but in here, oh, that produces a feeling for you, right, of discomfort or unsafety. And a lot of the time we think if I can get that guy to stop being mad, that I don't have to feel these feelings. But I want to suggest when we're trying to change outside what's outside our boundary, a lot of the time we're working too hard. And the image I have for that is being on a hamster wheel. Like you're going to have to be doing that forever. And what we can do with our self-attunement is to say, oh, okay, I need to actually meet myself in this feeling like, oh, it's very hard for me when this person is angry. And so maybe once we meet our own feeling, then we might need to communicate with this person about the impact of their behavior. But their behavior is not in here and we're not responsible for it. So another good metaphor sometimes is the idea of like just doing a little scan of your boundary and hey, how did that get in here? It's like a weed. You just pick it up and put it back outside. Like there's something in here that is not mine and I can bring it back outside. That's how we can take better care of ourselves. And so the last piece, back to the theme of guilt, which I know is such a big one, and I'm going to, suggest the neutralizing of guilt, right? So I don't think that we can avoid guilt. I've said that before. It's part of the dynamics of caregiving, but we can take it down a notch. We can neutralize it. And I've said this before that guilt is a poor motivator because it leads us to really have more vague boundaries. Guilt is often the motivator, right, of doing more than we wish to do. Even if we get a no from our inside experience, we might say yes, just so we don't have to feel guilty about something. We can meet feelings of guilt with the phrase, I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. This is a very powerful phrase to say to yourself when you start to feel guilty. I am not bad and I haven't done anything wrong. Just because someone else is upset with us, someone else is angry, someone else is asking us to do something, if we don't do that thing, we are not bad and we haven't done anything wrong. It is not your job to continually prove over and over again that you're a good person. You're already a good person. Know that others can have a different opinion outside your boundary. Invitations to feel guilty will always come, and you can decline them. In fact, I'm going to suggest you must decline some of them if you're going to make your caregiving sustainable. So remember, that when we feel less guilty, we feel less resentment too. If you can neutralize even some of the feelings of guilt that you have by meeting them in this way, I'm not bad and I haven't done anything wrong, we will feel less resentment as well. Because when we do things to avoid feeling guilty, we're actually contributing to future resentment. We have the right to feel good about ourselves even when we don't do everything right. And I think this is such a big, important theme in caregiving, right? What does it mean or look like to be doing caregiving right? A lot of us feel like, oh, we're not, we're doing caregiving wrong because of any of the dynamics or the feedback we might get on a given day, sometimes even from the person who's receiving the care. But we have the right to feel like a good person and like we have a boundary and a separate sense of self, even when other people don't feel like we're doing everything right. This is a very hard thing to do, and there is no right. There is no perfection in caregiving. Okay, I think that brings us to the 3-minute mark. Uh, we have 3 minutes left. I have not been reading the chat at all, so I don't know, Lori or Sarah, if there's just a quick question I can answer or something that came up.
There hasn't been anything question-wise that came out of the chat other than the guilt question earlier, which you addressed beautifully. Thank you. But I'm seeing lots of comments coming in on the chat of great appreciation for the topic. What you've shared has really resonated, it seems, in a lot of the chat. I know it's really resonated with myself.
Great.
So just a lot of appreciation in the chat box from everyone. So lots of "this is so good" type comments. So thank you everyone for
Awesome.
sharing that in the chat box. Maybe I'll turn it over if anyone does have any last questions for Jodie. We have about 2 minutes left. If you can take a quick minute and put your questions in the chat box so Jodie can address your questions before we part ways today. Okay. Yeah, and we will be putting the presentation, the recording up on the website there, so that should be up within a few days. Someone had noted that they want to go back and re-watch the presentation today. It was just that good.
And Jodie, I see someone's asking whether we will have the slides available. So thank
Yes,
you. Yes, we'll take you up on that offer and
for
we'll
sure.
post them with the video. Thank you.
Yes. And just like in the resources that you guys have prepared, which is so helpful, there are some other links to some free resources around self-compassion. There's the woman who developed this model of self-compassion, Dr. Kristen Neff. She has a book, but you don't have to read it. There's lots of really helpful, quick things on her website that she provides, resources, a little guided audio things, and just to help you, again, have that self-compassion practice, because your boundary has to be a place where you can tell yourself the truth about what you're feeling without judging. You know, if we don't have that safe space for ourselves, it's really hard to ask for it from the world. It's too inconsistent out there, you know? So for us to be able to witness ourselves in how hard and how how rich and also challenging what we're doing is so essential. And obviously this is also what we can do for each other in this kind of format as well, because it's just not understood. It's just not understood so much, um, in the greater world, to understand truly what it means to be a caregiver.